Pesachim, Daf Tzadi Zayin through Kuf Gimel. On Daf Tzadi Zayin, the Mishnah says, Hamafresh Nekeva Lepischo. Someone sets aside a female animal for his Karban Pesach. Karban Pesach can only be a male animal. Oh, Zachar ben Shtei Shanim. Or he sets aside a Zachar, a male animal, but it's Shtei Shanim. It's above the age that it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be Ben Shnaso. Yira Ad Sheyistayev. So the animal has Kedusha, but it can't be offered as a Pesach. So you let the animal graze until it gets a mum. V'yimacher, you sell it. V'yiplu damav l'nadavo l'shlamim. And the money is used to buy a carbon shlamim. The halacha in general is, poskim say, the Tfuah Shar says, if someone is makdish an animal b'zman hazeh, and he says hareza ola, for example, it's hektish. Even b'zman hazeh, you're not allowed to makdish an animal. Chazal didn't want you to do that, because since you can't offer it, it will just lead to problems. However, if you are makdish it, it's hektish midaraisa. And moreover, the Tfuah Shar adds, even if the person says, I didn't really mean it, I was joking, it doesn't matter, the Tfuah Shar says it has Kedusha anyway, and you can't do anything with it. You have to just wait until the behemoth dies, because it has Kedusha, and you can't be poded as long as it doesn't have a mum, and that's a real problem. Other poskim disagree. Other poskim say that Bizman as a person is neman to say, L'schot niskavanti, I meant it as a joke. Tfuah Shar himself goes on and says that this halacha, that when you makdish an animal, even Bizman as it has Kedusha, he says, even if the animal fundamentally is not kosher for this carbon, for example, you mafresh a nekeva for an ola, nekeva can't be a Pesach, and nekeva can't be an ola. He says, or even if you're mafresh birds for the carbon Pesach, the pigeons can be a carbon, but they can't be a carbon Pesach. Nevertheless, he says, it has Kedusha. People don't always realize. People think that l'chatchila Pesach has to be an animal, but the it can be a bird. So that has Kedusha as well. That only applies to animals that are valid as karbanos, albeit not in this exact context. A nekeva couldn't be offered for certain types of karbanos. Birds, pigeons can be offered for certain types of karbanos. If you're mafresh a chicken or a goose, he says, that can't be a carbon at all. He says, then we say everyone knows it's not really a carbon, and you don't really mean to be mafresh it as a carbon. The poskim discuss what happens if someone actually is mafresh a carbon Pesach or another carbon bizman hazeh. Poskim warn you not to do that. But what happens if someone was mafresh a carbon? The Marsham talks about a case. Someone had a calf, a baby cow, born in his flock, born in his herd, and first the fellow's son said, "Look, we have a carbon pesachal was born." The father said, "Esvet takazayin, a good carbon pesachal. It'll indeed be a good carbon pesach." That was the real shaila. The father may not have really meant it, but he said it's a carbon pesach. Even though a calf can't be a carbon pesach has to be a sheep. But we just said that if you mafresh any animal which is royal mizbeach, even if it's not roy for this carbon, like in the Mishnah, if a person's mafresh a nekeva lepischo, it has kedusha. It has to be yirad sheyistayev. So the Marsham has a whole debate about this, about whether he can say l'schok niskavanti. That's a machlokes achronim. The Marsham in his Das Torah and on the Tshuva, the Marsham says that even according to the Tfuah Shar, that says that in general you can't say l'schok niskavanti, then the Tfuah Shar would agree that if the carbon isn't suitable, like a calf or a carbon pesach, then even the Tfuah Shar would agree maybe that you could say l'schok niskavanti. Even though later the Tfuah Shar says that even a pigeon for the carbon pesach has kedusha, that's when you don't say l'schok niskavanti. But the Marsham considers the possibility that if the animal isn't really suitable for the carbon pesach, then maybe everyone would agree they can say l'schok niskavanti. He has other reasons for leniency, but at the end of the day, it is certainly a serious thing. A person should certainly avoid saying any animal of his is going to be any kind of carbon. It can lead to very severe problems. Besides the fact that it's usher, Chazal said it's usher to be makdish an animal because it can lead to takala. On Daf Tzadiches, the Mishnah says a chabura she'avad pischa, group of people lost their carbon pesach. They told someone, go out and find us a new carbon and check the carbon for us. Seyu vakei sheshchot aleinu. He goes and he finds one, and they, in the meantime, they went and they got another one on their own. So they told him to do it. So they have two carbon pesach now, the one he got and the one they got. So the Mishnah has a long discussion about which of the carbon pesachs is valid for which of the people, for the shliach, for the chabura. So in this first case, the first line of the Mishnah is, Im shalom nishchan rishon, if he shechted the one he found as the replacement first, then hu ochel mishalo, v'hein ochel imo mishalo. Then if his carbon was shechted first, that becomes the carbon for all of them because they authorized him to find a replacement for them, so that animal becomes their carbon Pesach as well. There's a tshuva of Rashi, who learns an important halacha with practical ramifications from this din. Rashi talks about a case of a woman who appointed a shliach, an agent, to accept her get, and then he wasn't doing it, so she appointed a second shliach, and then the first shliach went ahead and accepted and found the husband and accepted the get. The question is, do we say that when she appointed the second shliach, she was implicitly withdrawing her authorization from the first shliach? Do we say that when you find a replacement, you tacitly withdraw the authorization from the first one? So Rashi says no. Rashi says just because you appoint a second shliach doesn't mean that you deauthorize the first one. And he brings a raya from our Gemara. Our Gemara says when they authorized him to be a shliach, as long as he shechted his first, his shlichus is valid, even though they may have already found their own animal. As long as they haven't shechted their own animal, it's a race whoever shechted first. If he shechted his animal first, even though they already began to get their own animal, they already purchased their own animal. So you don't say that purchasing the animal is a withdrawal of authorization. Unless they actually shechted first, his shlichus goes through. So you see the fact that they decided to do it on their own, they decided to do it on their own as a backup. But you don't say that even if a person decides to do it himself, you don't say that that constitutes a withdrawal of authorization. Certainly when the woman didn't do it herself, she just appointed a second shliach, we don't say that that constitutes a withdrawal of authority from the first shliach. The Torah brings Machlokes Rishonim about it. It's a major Machlokes Rishonim. L'halacha, we paskin like this Rashi. If a woman makes one shliach and then makes a second shliach, we don't say that that's a withdrawal of authority from the first shliach. And that's how we paskin in the Shulchan Aruch. Daf Tzadi Tes, we have the next parak, Arvei Pesachim, the laws of the Seder, and so on. So the first Mishnah says that Erev Pesach Samach L'Mincha, when it's close to evening, Lo yochel ad mat shetakshach, you shouldn't eat to preserve your appetite. Afilu ani shebi Yisrael lo yochel ad sheyasev, that even an ani has to eat with haseba, with leaning. And also v'lo yifchesu lo me'arba kosos shel yayin, they shouldn't give him less than 4 kosos of wine, afilu min hatamchoi, even from the charity collection. What does v'lo yifchesu lo mean? Who shouldn't give him less? So Rashbam says it means the Gabbai Tzedakah, those who are in charge of the charity funds, they have to make sure to give him at least enough money or wine to fulfill the mitzvah of 4 kosos. Tosas discusses this. Tosas also basically accepts this pshat. They have to give him 4 kosos of wine. The Shulchan Aruch doesn't actually bring this. Shulchan Aruch just says that arba kosos is very important. Even an ani who needs tzedakah should sell his clothing, sell the shirt off his back, so to speak, or borrow money, or hire himself out to get money for the arba kosos. Doesn't say that the Gabbai Tzedakah have to give him, but the Mishnah Berurah adds that. The Mishnah Berurah says he has to sell his shirt if the Gabbayim didn't give him money for arba kosos. Still, he has to do it himself. But certainly he says they have to give him. They're obligated to give him resources for arba kosos. To Mahani, he says that some communities, Mishnah Berurah says, some communities are not particular about this. It's pashut, it's mavur b'kama poskim, that there's an obligation on the Gabbai Tzedakah to give him money for arba kosos. Tosas points out that the Mishnah says 4 kosos. What about his family? What about his wife and children? Don't you need 4 kosos per person? So Tosas actually raises the possibility that you can be motzi your family in arba kosos, just as you can be motzi your family in kiddush. The one member of the household can make kiddush and everyone else can fulfill the mitzvah, even if they don't drink. The minhag is often to drink, but you don't have to do that. You can be yotzei kiddush just by hearing kiddush from someone who makes it. Tosas raises that the possibility the same thing applies to arba kosos, that the head of the household can drink the 4 cups, everyone else is yotzei. Tosas goes back and forth, but Tosas concludes that that's not the halacha. Tosas says nira lahachmer, that everyone should drink arba kosos, and that's certainly the accepted halacha, that everyone in the family has to drink arba kosos. Again, dealing with this case of someone who has exactly enough of 4 kosos, Magen Avram says, should he split 2 and 2 for the first night, 2 the second night? Should he have kiddush and birchas hamazon on a kos each night, 2 and 2, or should he drink 4? Magen Avram says he should drink 4. First of all, he says, since we know the calendar, really the first night is the Iker Yontif Deraisa, we keep the second day, Yontif Sheni Shel Golias, but it's not as important as the first day. Also, he says, because of Persumei Nisa, to have the mitzvah of 4 kosos, to have a unit, to have a complete set of 4, that's very important. So it's better to have 4 the first night than to split the 4 between the 2 nights. Tosfos says that after he rejects his initial possibility of having 4 just for the head of the household, just for one person. He says, even though the women, the children, everyone in the household should drink, even the children. That's how we pass in Shulchan Aruch. Tinoku shegiel lechinuch, children who have reached the age of chinuch, there is a mitzvah that each one of them should have his own cup for the 4 kossos. On Daf and Kuf and Kuf Aleph, the Gemara discusses the Kiddush in the Beis HaKnesses, Kiddush in the Shul. So the Gemara brings Machlokas Rav and Shmuel about it. Rav says that they're Yotzei Kiddush. Shmuel says Afkidei Kiddush lo Yatzu. Kiddush in Shul is not valid. Why? The Gemara explains, because of Kiddush Makom Suda. That you can only fulfill the mitzvah of Kiddush by making Kiddush where you eat. If you don't eat in Shul, you don't fulfill the mitzvah of Kiddush in Shul. So the Gemara says, according to Shmuel, according to Rav, why do you make Kiddush at home? If you Yotzei in Shul, Rav doesn't eat Kiddush in Makom Suda, that's to be motzi the other members of your family who weren't in Shul. According to Shmuel, that you're not Yotzei Kiddush in Shul, why do you make it at all? For the guests. There were guests in Shul who would eat in Shul, and those guests would be Yotzei Kiddush. But a person who doesn't eat in Shul, like most of us, we don't eat in Shul, certainly not Friday night in general, so you're not Yotzei Kiddush in Shul. So the halacha seems to be that you only make Kiddush in Shul for those guests. We paskin like Shmuel, we do paskin Kiddush in Makom Suda is a requirement. So the halacha seems to be, following Shmuel, that you would only make Kiddush in Shul if there are guests in Shul who are eating in Shul. So the Rishonim struggle with this. They say in their time that the minhag was still widespread to make Kiddush in Shul, but there were no guests who were eating in Shul. And society didn't work like that. So how can you make Kiddush in Shul? There are no guests. There's no Kiddush in Makom Suda. What's the point of that Kiddush? So some Rishonim said we make Kiddush to be motzi those who don't know how to make Kiddush. That lahotzi misha eni yodea lekadosh. That the Rishonim bring this from Ben Yonah. That the Beis Yosef brings b'shem l'rosh b'shem Ben Yonah. That the Kivan sheyesh b'nei adam shein yodin lekadesh, we still make Kiddush in Shul. But the Gemara didn't say that reason. First of all, it's not a valid Kiddush because it's not Makom Suda. So what does it help? It's unfortunate they don't know how to make Kiddush, but it's not a valid Kiddush because it's not Makom Suda. Also, the Gemara said the Archim, the Gemara didn't say anything about people who don't know how to make Kiddush. The Ran said that the Takana really has no pshat today, but since they were masakin it, the Takana remains in force even if the original reason is no longer valid. Beis Yosef says that's hard to understand. Kiddush in Shul is not a takana. They did it for practical reasons, for pragmatic reasons, for people who were guests in Shul. There was no official takana of Chazal to make Kiddush. Beis Yosef has his own explanation. In any event, the Torah brings another difficult to understand explanation from the B'Shem, the Rav Natranai Gon. He has difficulty with that as well. So the halacha, the poskim struggle to come up with a plausible reason for why we still make Kiddush in Shul. At the end of the day, the Shulchan Aruch rules, given the somewhat dubious rationale for the minhag, he says, the minhag is that we do make Kiddush in Shul, even though it's because of Archim, and that doesn't apply today, he just says, lo batla takana, that the takana remains, and that's why people make Kiddush in Shul. That's the reason for those places that still make Kiddush in Shul. However, Yoser Tov, it is preferable, he says, the ideal minhag is to abandon the minhag of making Kiddush in Shul, and that's the minhag in Eretz Yisrael, not to do that anymore. The Ramah says, the Ramah just says, when you make Kiddush in Shul, you stand. The Mishnah Berurah says that the minhag is that we do make Kiddush in Shul on Shabbos and Yom Tov. The Medina Seinu, in our region, we still make Kiddush in Shul hundreds of years later, in the time of the Mishnah Berurah, the early 20th century. We still make Kiddush except the first night of Pesach. And this is still the custom today in many traditional shuls. Kiddush is still made on Friday night in Shul. In some shuls I've davened at, in some shuls that daven Nusach Svar, the shuls in New York that I've been to, often don't make Kiddush in Shul. The yeshivas often don't make Kiddush in Shul, but traditional community shuls often still follow this minhag that, as Mishnah Berurah says, if they still make Kiddush in Shul on Friday night, even though the minhag rests on somewhat dubious foundations. The question is, what do you do with the wine of the Kiddush in Shul? The problem is you're not really Yotzei Kiddush because it's not Makom Suda, you're not eating. So the minhag is that you give it to a child because an adult can't drink it because it's not Makom Suda. Some say the child should be lo higia l'chinuch because the child who's higia l'chinuch also shouldn't be drinking Kiddush lo Makom Suda. But the Mishnah Berurah says, the Magen Avraham brings from the poskim that you can give it even to a katan who is higia l'chinuch, and it's actually better like that because giving it to a katan shlo higia l'chinuch defeats the purpose. The whole point of giving it to a katan is that somebody should drink it because he's making a bracha on the wine. If he's lo higia l'chinuch, that doesn't work. So it's better to give it to a katan shegiya l'chinuch. I'm not sure what the minhag is. I think I've seen shuls give it to katanim of different ages, but it's a discussion in the poskim which is actually preferable. On Daf Kuf Aleph, again on Daf Kuf Aleph, the Gemara continues. It segues from the discussion about Kiddush and Shul to the discussion of Kiddush and Makom Suda. Shmuel holds that the Kiddush and Shul can only work for the Archim, not for the ordinary citizens who go home and eat, because Shmuel says, Ein Kiddush el Makom Suda, you can only make Kiddush where you have the Suda. The Gemara distinguishes between bias labayas and makom lamakom. That the Gemara distinguishes between going from one building to another building as opposed to two places in one building. And the Gemara says no, even makom lamakom can be a problem of kiddush makom suda to two different rooms in the same building can also be a problem. That's what we pass in Shulchan Aruch. Ein kiddush like Shmuel el makom suda. In two different corners of one room, two different parts of one room, pina lapina, that's called makom suda. However, two different rooms is considered is more of a problem. The bayis l'sukkah, going from the house to the sukkah, the Ramah says, is like pina lapina, and that's fine. Mishnah Berurah explains that's talking about a sukkah inside the house where you just take off the roof. Post can discuss what the status of a sukkah that shares a wall with the house, that the Mishnah Berurah talks about the sukkah is outside and the wall of the house separates between the sukkah and the house. That's like cheder l'cheder. That's like room to room. Room to room we paskin is a compromise. If you intended to go when you made kiddush, that's okay. So if you make kiddush in one room and then go someplace else to wash and eat, that would be fine. If you don't intend to do it, Mishnah Berurah talks about when you get rained out of the sukkah and after kiddush you go into the house, that's more of a problem. All this discussion is when the sukkah is either in the house or when the sukkah is right outside the house. When the sukkah, as is the case of many of our sukkahs, are actually in the backyard or in the driveway, you actually have to walk outside to go from the house to the sukkah. That arguably is considered bias labayas, and even having das doesn't help. Now, usually when we make kiddush in the sukkah, we go into the house to wash, let's say Netilas Yadayim, and then we come back to the sukkah. So that's actually something that's discussed a couple of sifim later in Shulchan Aruch. The Ramah says you have to eat right away after you make kiddush. You shouldn't delay. You shouldn't do anything else between kiddush and eating. Mishnah Berurah brings in machlokes. If you get up and leave the house and then come back to the house, leave the room and come back to the room, is that okay or not? Some poskim say that's fine as long as the suda ends up in the same room as the kiddush. Other poskim say that it's a problem, that it's a real problem, that if you left the house, even if you came back, it's a problem. So again, from one room to another room, we say it's okay if that was your intention to begin with. So everyone who eats in his dining room and has in mind that when he knows when he makes kiddush, he's going to get up and go to the kitchen to wash Netilas Yadayim, that's going to be fine. The question is in the sukkah and the house, when you make kiddush in the sukkah and you know you're going to get up and go into the house is separated from the sukkah across the driveway, across the yard, then you're going to go back. Is that called shinui makom or not? That potentially is a real issue, and that's why I think there is some basis for not doing that, for bringing water into the sukkah so you can wash Netilas Yadayim in the sukkah and then make hamotzi without having to go from house to house between kiddush and the suda. The Ramah brings another leniency here, which would apply to the sukkah as well. The Ramah says that some say that if you can see one place from the other, even if you go from two different buildings, that's fine. But the Mishnah Berurah says many poskim disagree with that. Many poskim say that seeing is not enough, and it's not good to rely on that by itself. That ideally you should not go from building to building between kiddush and the suda. The Gemara goes on about kiddush and makom suda. The Gemara says that if you want to fulfill the mandate of kiddush and makom suda, te'imu midi, you should eat something after you make kiddush. What do you have to eat? What kind of something? Tosfos says bread. Tosfos, other Rishonim say you have to eat bread. If you don't eat bread, you don't fulfill kiddush and makom suda. The Gaonim say, the Shulchan Aruch brings from the Gaonim, kiddush and makom suda means a little bit. It has to be a kazayas, but a little bit. Mishnah Berurah says kazayas, but a little bit, or even drinking a glass of wine. Even that's considered makom suda. Some poskim say the glass of wine has to be, the Shulchan Aruch says it has to be the shir that you make a bracha achrona on. Some say that means the kiddush itself, as long as you drank a full revius for kiddush, that's enough. Some say it means a separate glass of wine after the kiddush, but the Gaonim say that's enough as well. Or bread certainly, or wine, but just peiros, just eating an apple, eating some potatoes, that is not enough. The Mishnah Berurah says that if wine is enough, then certainly minei targima, from hey minim, from the chameshes aminim, certainly cake and mizonos certainly is enough, because that's better than wine. But other kinds of peiros, or other kinds of drinks, beer, or soda, other types of drinks, or just peiros, not from the chameshes aminim, would not be sufficient. The common custom, of course, is people rely, certainly for Shacharis, people rely on mizonos, people eat cake at a kiddush, and they say that's kiddush makom suda. There are other things to rely on there. Ramosha has a famous idea that as long as you go home and eat bread, you can be more lenient about kiddush in the shul, because the kiddush in the shul to allow you to eat is enough to eat mizonos, so you'll eat bread when you go home. But people rely, apparently it's common to rely on eating mizonos in the shul, not entirely muskam. The Mishnah Berurah brings from Rabbi Akiva Eiger that according to many Rishonim, the wine is not good enough. Not sure if all those Rishonim necessarily hold cake is not good enough either, but the cake was a kal v'chomer from wine. But there are poskim who insisted on bread. There are poskim who say that to do kiddush makom suda you should only eat bread. But basically there are three opinions. Some say dafka bread, some say wine or cake, chameshes aminim is also enough, and there are actually shittas that allow the peiros as well. The Mishnah Berurah brings that even though we said peiros not, there is actually an opinion that says that Shiltei Gibarim says peiros is also enough. However, the Mishnah Berurah doesn't recommend relying on that. It's not the ikar, but if someone is sick, if someone has a need to do it, some poskim, Mishnah Berurah, some other poskim are more lenient and allow relying on even non-chameshes aminim if when necessary, but that's definitely not ideal. That definitely should be avoided wherever possible. One should eat mizonos or ideally bread, but the minhag seems to be lenient about mizonos. On Dafim Kuf Aleph and Kuf Beis, the Gemara talks about a related topic. We've been discussing shinui makom between Kiddush and Suda. The Gemara gets into a detailed and very complex sugya about shinui makom in general, whether a person eats bread, potatoes, a glass of water, and then he changes his location. What is the halacha of bracha? Does he need a new bracha rishona, a new bracha achrona? That's the sugya of shinui makom in general. The Gemara says Rabbi Yochanan said shinui makom ein tzarich levarich. The Gemara says Meisvei, the Brisa says Shinui Makom Tzarich Levarich, Tiyufta de Rabbi Yochanan to Yufta, we paskin, not like Rabbi Yochanan, we paskin Shinui Makom is Tzarich Levarich. Which bracha do you have to make? You certainly have to make a new bracha rishona. If a person had a potato and then walked to his friend's house, now he wants to eat a new potato, you certainly need to make a new bari pri adama. What about bracha achrona on the old potato? You need a new bracha achrona also before you start eating, or can you just wait to eat the second potato and then make a bracha achrona on both? That's machlokas Rambam and other Rishonim, the Shulchan Aruch and the Rambam paskin that if a person does shinui makom, he needs a new bracha achrona as well before he continues eating. The Ramah paskins like other Rishonim, you don't need a new bracha, and that's the minhag of Ashkenaz at least. You don't need a new bracha achrona, you just need a new bracha rishona. So we pass in shinui makom is a shinui, you need a new bracha, but only a new bracha rishona, not a new bracha achrona. The Gemara has, over Kuf Aleph and Kuf Beis, a few other statements in the sugya. So the Gemara brings that, again, just like we saw about Kiddush, the same type of discussion we had about Kiddush, Hada Amrit shinui makom tzarich levarich, you need a new bracha, lo shonu el mibayis lebayis, avol makom l'makom lo. That only applies when you move buildings, but when you go from place to place in one building, then that's not a problem. So again, there are really three madregas. There are three levels. There's two places within the same room, two rooms in the house, two different houses entirely. So we paskin that leaving the house is certainly shinui makom. Going from room to room, Mishnah Berurah brings many poskim say that's also shinui makom. But there we say that if you intended to do it originally, that's okay. If a person started eating in his kitchen and planned eventually to take the food upstairs to his bedroom, if that was his intention, that's not called shinui makom. From corner to corner of the same room, to move around the table, to move from the couch to the table in the same room, that is not a shinui makom at all. And that's, even if you didn't intend to do that, within the same room is not a shinui makom at all. So the Gemara has another statement. The Gemara brings machlokes Rav Chisda and Rav Sheshes, whether shinui makom applies only to things that don't need a bracha achrona b'makoman. Certain foods don't require the bracha achrona to be made in the same place. That's considered shinui makom. But something that does need a bracha b'makoman, like bread, ein tzarich levarich, then there's no din shinui makom. My taima lekiva kama hadar. Since you're kavua in the first place because you need a bracha b'makoma, then the rule of shinui makom doesn't apply. That's Rav Chisda. Rav Sheshes says echad zeh ve'echad zeh tzarich levarich. Doesn't matter, whatever food you ate, if you move from building to building, then, or from room to room without das, then that's called Shini Makom and you need a new bracha. So how do we paskin? So this is again a machlokes Rambam and other Rishonim. That the Rambam paskins like Rav Sheshes doesn't matter. It's always considered Shini Makom. However, again, the Rosh and the other Rishonim paskin like Rav Chisda, and that's how the Ramah paskins. That's Ermin and Ashkenaz. That if you eat bread, then Shini Makom b'diavad is not a problem. Even if you move from house to house, l'kiva kama hadar, you're always considered kavua in the first place. We paskin like Rav Chisda that if a person ate bread, then the din of Shini Makom b'diavad does not apply. However, there still is a din l'chatchila you're not allowed to do Shini Makom. We'll discuss that more in a moment. One last statement of the Gemara. The Gemara says there were chaverim, there were a group of people who were eating and they left. They went to shul, they went to the Beis Midrash, Beis Knesses. So the Tanakama says they don't need a new bracha Rishona or Achrona. Rav Yehuda says it depends. Sometimes they do. The only time they don't is if they left some of their number behind. Leaving some of their number behind, again, establishes a kvius, and that eliminates the concern of Shini Makom. But if nobody remained behind, if they all left, then they need a new bracha Rishona and Achrona. Again, we paskin that b'diavad. You don't need a new bracha Rishona, a new bracha Achrona, but you need a new bracha Rishona if you left nobody behind. So this is how we paskin that Shini Makom is mibayas l'bayas. We paskin like the other Rishona, not like the Rambam. You need a new bracha Rishona, not a new bracha Achrona. If you left some people behind, then you don't need a new. Then it's not Shini Makom b'diavad. And similarly, if you ate something that was tricha bracha b'makoma, like bread, then again it's not considered Shini Makom. That's how we paskin. So this din that if you ate things and eat bracha b'makoma and it's not a Shini Makom, that's only if you ate a kizayis. If it was less than a kizayis, then you don't need a bracha b'makoma. You don't need a bracha at all. So then that wouldn't help you. But if you ate at least a kizayis of bread, this is relevant when you wash. If you wash and then you ate a full kizayis, then you went outside to go talk to someone and you came back, that's not Shini Makom because you ate a kizayis. But if you ate less than a kizayis, you took one bite of bread and then you ran outside, that would be considered Shini Makom. The L'chatchila, the Ramah brings, you should not leave even in a case where it won't be Shini Makom, unless it's a mitzvah of eres. Unless you're going to miss the opportunity to do a mitzvah, L'chatchila, you should never leave, even though it won't be Shini Makom b'diavad, because we're afraid you'll forget to bench. And the fact is that happens. This happens to everyone. Often you say, I'll bench later, and you forget, you get distracted, and you don't bench, or you forget if you benched, or the food might get digested, the post can bring, and you lose the opportunity to make the bracha, because the benefit of the food will have gone. So L'dvar Rishus, for a discretionary purpose, you should not leave without making a bracha, because we're afraid you'll forget. For a mitzvah of eres, you can. The Shulchan Aruch is mashma only mitzvah of eres. A mitzvah that can wait, you really shouldn't. If you can do the mitzvah later, you shouldn't. Bir Halacha brings that's a question, but at least for a mitzvah of eres, you can leave. If a person leaves for a rishus, should he at least make a bracha achrona? So the Mishnah Berurah brings that no, you should not. That even though we're afraid you'll forget, don't make a bracha achrona, because making a bracha achrona and coming back and then making a new bracha rishona is a question of bracha she'eina tzricha. So really, you shouldn't get involved in the whole situation. You shouldn't leave at all unless it's a mitzvah of eres. But if you do, the Mishnah Berurah says you should not make the bracha achrona if you plan on coming back and continuing eating. And Mishnah Berurah adds that this concern, and you'll forget to make the bracha, is not limited to bread. Even if you've eaten just an apple, you ate an apple, someone calls you and you want to go outside and talk to him, and so there is a concern you'll forget to make the bracha achrona, even though it's only bar nefashos. That's also an important bracha. So l'chatchila, you really shouldn't leave without making a bracha achrona. It's not right to leave at all, because there's always a concern that you'll forget to make the bracha achrona, whatever the appropriate bracha achrona might be. On Dafim Kuf Beis and Kuf Gimel, the Gemara brings a number of halachas regarding Havdalah, and Havdalah when Shabbos and Yontif come back to back. So the Gemara says, Gufa, Yontif Shechal Liyas Achar Shabbos, when Yontif falls on Matzai Shabbos, you make Kiddush and Havdalah and Ner all together, a bunch of brachas. What do? The Gemara brings no fewer than 8 shitas. The Gemara says, Rav says, Yachnaha, Yayin Kiddush Ner Havdalah. Shmuel says, Yanhak, Yayin Ner Havdalah Kiddush. Rabbah says, Yahanak, Yayin Havdalah Ner Kiddush. Levi says, Kanya, Kiddush Ner Yayin Havdalah. Rabbanan say, Kina, Kiddush Yayin Ner Havdalah. Marbraid Ravina says, Nikia, Ner Kiddush Yayin Havdalah. Marta Amar Mishmeid Rav Yeshua, Nihak, Ner Yayin Havdalah Kiddush. And then the Gemara brings another opinion later. The Amar Rabbi Yishmael bar Rabbi Yossi, Shamar Mishum Aviv, Shamar Mishum Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya, Nahiyak, Ner Havdalah Yayin Kiddush. How do we paskin? The Gemara finally brings Machlokes Abaye and Rava, 5-letter acronyms. Abaye Amar Yayin Kiddush Ma Ner Havdalah, Yak Zinaha. Rava Amar, Rava says the familiar Yak Nahaz, Yayin Kiddush Ner Havdalah's man. Yayin means Bara Pri Agafen, then Kiddush, the bracha of Kiddush itself. Ner is Bara Mina Ha'esh. Havdalah is the bracha of Havdalah, Hamavdil Bein Kodesh LaKodesh in this case. Zman is Shechianu. V'hilchas Rava, we pass like Rava, and that is the famous Yak Nahaz, Yayin Kiddush Ner Havdalah's man. The Gemara goes on, the Gemara brings machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and Rameir and Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Rameir and Rabbi Yehuda argue what Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel actually said, but Rabbi Yehuda says, machlokas Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is what to do about Mar Vala Besamim. Beis Shammai says first Mar, then Besamim, first Bari Marei Ha'esh, and then Bari Minei Besamim. Beis Hillel says first Besamim, first Bari Minei Besamim, whatever bracha you're making for Besamim, Ve'achakach Mar, and afterwards the bracha Bari Marei Ha'esh. And Na'agu Ha'am, the minhag is Beis Hillel Libet Rabbi Yehuda, and that's of course what we do, that we say the bracha first of Besamim, and then on the bracha of Eish. Gemara brings another memra on Kuf Gimel, Hachi Yamarav, Kevan Damrisu Havlan and Nevarech, Itzrul al Mishti, my taima da'as chaisu dataichu. When a person's eating and he says Havlan and Nevarech, in English, let's bench, let's do Berchas HaMazon, he's not allowed to drink any more wine. Why? Because Hesach Hadas, once a person has decided, has committed himself that he's finished eating, he's finished drinking, he's done, at that point, Hesach Hadas, before we discuss Shini Makum, Hesach Hadas is similar. Once a person is Mesiach Das, he can no longer drink further without a new bracha rishon. The Shulchan Aruch brings this, but there is a machlokes rishonim whether this applies to only to drinking. The Gemara said drinking. What about eating? A person that Havlan Nevarech, can he eat? He won't drink anymore, but can he eat? So the Shulchan Aruch first says you're not allowed to drink. And then he says Achila Dina Kishtia. The same halach applies to eating according to the Rush. But according to Rabbeinu Yonah and the Ran, you're allowed to eat. Even if a person said Havlan Nevarech and he finished eating, he said he's finished, but that only applies to drinking, not to eating. The Havlan literally means give us the coast. They used to bench on a coast. Some people still do. Give us the coast and we'll bench. The Mishnah Berurah says that if you say Tein lanu hakos levarech, that means you're finished eating. But if there's no coast, then when you say bo nevarech, you say let's bench. We're going to bench. That also has the same din of hesach hadas. Mishnah Berurah adds even internal hesach hadas, even hesach hadas belibo. You say, you think that you're done, you think, I'm finished, that's also Hesach Hadas. What's considered a really solid commitment, what's just tentative, that can be a difficult question sometimes, but a solid commitment, whether verbal or even mental, even internal, means you can no longer eat without making a new bracha. Now the Gemara only said Shtia, so one opinion says Achila is a Reu K'Shtia, the other opinion says that Shtia is different, because eating, a person is always, once he's eating, he often wants to eat more. A person's never completely finished eating. He's always holding open the possibility of eating more. Unless you actually wash mayim achronim, that's a hesach hadas even from eating. But saying havlan and nevarech, then you still have the right to eat because you're not really mesiach das from eating, but from drinking, the hesach hadas is easier, and the threshold for hesach hadas from drinking is lower. The Mishnah Berurah says, then the Bir Halacha, he explains, many poskim hold like the Rush, that Havu Nevarech is considered Hesach Hadas even for eating, and you can't eat. The Shulchan Aruch is Machriya that way elsewhere. Therefore, Lechatchila, he says, a person who said Havlan Nevarech really should be careful not to eat. Once a person said, perhaps even thought, as the Mishnah Berurah says, once a person committed himself and decided and had a conviction that he's done eating, he should not eat anymore without a new bracha rishon.